Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be taking a look at one of Fnatic's brand new pads. Today we're going to be taking a look at the FNATIC Dash2. Now, thank you very much to Fnatic who was kind enough to send this out early for me to take a look at. I greatly appreciate it. Now, this is an updated version to the previous Dash mouse pad that Fnatic has previously released. There have been some improvements to the pad. This is kind of like a reinvention of that pad, but in some ways Fnatic has kind of gone overboard and they've kind of over-engineered the pad to a state where the pad is definitely better than its predecessor. However, it does also have some negative connotations that kind of make it feel like its predecessor, not a brand new pad. It's a very confusing pad, and today we're going to take a deep dive and find out what Fnatic did right and what Fnatic did wrong here with the FNATIC Dash2. Now, before we get into it, as always with everything you see here on the channel, you're going to get an unbiased and brutally honest take of everything you see here, regardless of a free or a discounted unit. And as always, timestamps will be available down in the video description for you to take a look at if you're looking for a particular topic. Let's start off by talking about the product info, what has changed here from the Dash2 to the original Dash, and then we'll talk about the unboxing and the in-game performance and find out how this pad actually performs. Alrighty, now in terms of the product information, the FNATIC Dash2 Max is an update to the previous Dash pad. This is obviously going to have some improvements, of course, in the design, the overall feel of the pad. It is still a speed designed pad, however, it does perform a little differently, but I'll talk about that a little later. Now, there are two sizes available. There is a large and an extra large. The large is coming in at 480 millimeters by 400 millimeters, and it is 6 millimeters thick, and it is $54.99 USD. And the extra large is 480 millimeters by 480 millimeters and has the same 6 millimeter thickness, and that one is coming in at $59.99 USD. Now, when Fnatic initially reached out for me to take a look at these pads, the biggest thing that caught my eye about the Dash2 was the thickness. Now, this is the thickest pad I've ever seen in the peripheral space or heard of. The previous thickest pad I've seen was the Raven Mori V2, which was 4.3 millimeters thick. Now, 6 millimeter thickness is definitely an interesting selling point here, because there's a reason you don't see a lot of very thick mouse pads, because there could be a lot of downsides if the pad isn't executed properly because of this extra thickness. And unfortunately here, what Fnatic has done here with the Dash2 is that their execution of this thicker pad does leave a lot to be desired, just because there are some shortfalls of this. It does have some benefits in terms of performance, but the 6 millimeter thickness is very much a double-edged sword kind of situation when it comes to the Dash2, but we'll talk more in detail about that a little later in this video. Alright, now in terms of the unboxing experience, this packaging is very similar to what we saw with Lethal Gaming Gear's packaging they used for the Neptune. It is a rolled design. It's not as tight as like a rolled pack you saw for like the HyperX Pulsefire mat or the Zowie GSR2. It's a lot wider. However, compared to the Lethal Gaming Gear packaging, there is a difference in the packaging size. So the Lethal Gaming Gear one was around 5 inches, where the Fnatic one here is 4 inches. Now, normally I don't mind rolled pads like if it's like a rubber base. However, the Dash2 is using a pour-on base, which means that because the rolling of the pad is so tight, this pad was really creased when it came out of the box, and the edges of the pad kept lifting up off the desk. It took about like 4 days of me putting heavy objects on top of the pad overnight for that to actually go away. Now, traditionally, you can just reverse roll the pad just to easily fix that. However, you can't actually roll this pad because there's a potential of you damaging the surfacing, which makes it very difficult to get rid of creasing from the packaging. So this is one shortfall here on the Dash2 right off the top. I would rather see a wider packaging like what we saw with the Lethal Gaming Gear, or I'd rather see it be flat packed, because again, rolled pour-on or pour-on-like bases just are not that great. It'd be much better to see this being a flat pack design. Now, on top of that, another note from the unboxing is that this pad did have a fairly strong chemical smell coming from the base when I first unboxed it. However, it did dissipate quite quickly. Now, this is a pre-production unit. I'm assuming the retail versions will not have this issue, but I just want to mention that if your pad does have a little bit of a smell, just leave it in your bathroom and just let it air out for a night or so and it should go away. All right, now in terms of the Dash2's performance in-game, overall, it was a really good performing pad. However, the quirkiness of the 6 millimeter design did definitely hamper the performance of the Dash2. It kind of wasted the potential of the pad, in my opinion, where if this pad was a little thinner, it'd be significantly better. Now, in terms of how the performance profile for this pad is, it does remind me a lot of the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune, where it's designed to be a speed pad, but due to the softness of the pad, it ends up feeling a lot more like a fast hybrid pad in terms of how it feels, because there's so much control variability from the softness of the pad. That is something we see here on the Dash2, and that is something I will talk about a little later. Now, the Dash2 being a speedier design pad does definitely lean itself better towards more tracking and dynamic games like Overwatch, Fortnite, Bad Business. It is surprisingly good for static-oriented games like Valorant and Counter-Strike and Rainbow Six due to the softness of the pad, but this is one area where the thickness really does have a lot of quirks with it, because it does perform well in some cases, but it also doesn't perform well in a lot of other cases. So the static performance was very mixed. The dynamic and tracking performance was great. Static was a bit of an issue. Now, as I mentioned before, the biggest reason for the kind of quirkiness and the weirdness of the Dash2 is the thickness. So let's talk about that next. Alrighty, now as I mentioned before, the Dash2 is 6 millimeters thick. Now, before for the Dash 2, the thickest pad I have ever heard of or used was the Raven Mori V2, which was coming in at 4.3 millimeters thick. Now, Fnatic's kind of advertising or justification for this super thick design is that it gives this pad a very high degree of control variability because you can press into the pad to get a lot more control, which isn't something new. We've seen that on a lot of other pads, but here on the Dash 2, because it's so thick, there's a much higher scale of that, but that also does work against it in some situations, so we'll talk about later. Now, the other reason why Fnatic decided to go for the 6mm design on the Dash 2 is that apparently this thicker design is supposed to help mitigate wrist strain. Now, to their credit, this does actually work in some cases depending on your arm positioning on the pad. However, the thickness of the pad has a lot of drawbacks. Now, the issue with really thick pads, specifically ones that go above like the 4.5mm range, is that if the pad is so thick, it's going to make vertical movements or y-axis movements extremely difficult because there's going to be a significant amount of drag on your forearm going up and down the pad. Now, of course, this doesn't matter if you're doing a fingertip grip or you're doing like a floating grip. However, for the vast majority of people, myself included, who rest their arm against their pad, this can be a big problem. Now, to be fair, I thought I was going to have this exact same problem on the Raven Mori V2 because when I covered that pad, it was the thickest pad I tried, but that pad just narrowly avoided that issue where there was a crazy amount of extra y-axis drag. Unfortunately, because Fnatic has gone with the 6mm design here on the Dash 2, the Dash 2 does not avoid this pitfall. Now, in my experience of using the Dash 2, I ran into significant issues with y-axis performance. Even x-axis performance even had some issues as well, where if you're going across the pad in an x-axis, you're still pushing up a little bit. Like if you're tracking someone on an upwards curve, you still have to move up while going on the x-axis. And the biggest problem I found from this pad, there was so much drag from the edge of this pad, it made those kinds of movements extremely inconsistent. For flat x-axis movements or like curved down x-axis movements, they were okay, but a lot of the dynamic performance did really suffer here on this pad. Now, this is primarily a combination due to the surfacing and of course the thickness of this pad, but this is one of the biggest downsides of this pad, where if this pad was 4mm thick, this would not be a problem. Now, this is where I do have a lot of questions about the 6mm design because yes, this mouse pad, because it's thicker, does have a higher degree of control variability and of course does reduce wrist strain, but at the same time though, you're heavily impacting the y-axis performance and x-y-axis performance for a lot of users because not everyone's using a floated grip or not everyone's doing like a weird like donk claw grip. Not everyone's doing those kinds of grip styles. So the people who do rest their arm on the base of the pad are going to have significant problems. Now, of course, there is a way around this where you could just rest your entire arm on the pad and play towards the top of the pad, but that also has its issues because the surfacing of this pad is also very weird. So let's talk about that next. Now, the Dash 2 surface is a very unique stitch. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this before. It honestly looks like a Fnatic logo just like glitched out everywhere. It's kind of funny in that regards. However, this surface stitching did have some really weird quirks in terms of performance. Now, in terms of how it felt, it did remind me a lot of the Raven Mori V2, but the surfacing was a little less pronounced, of course, because it's a speed pad, it's going to feel like that. Now, under the microscope, you can see that this stitching is kind of just everywhere. It has some linearity to it, but it also has like a lot of randomness to it. It's a very weird stitch. The problem with this stitch is that, as you can see here, there are a lot of very deep gaps in this surface stitching, which is something that can be a bit of a problem. Now, I wasn't able to replicate this issue, but during my testing of the Dash 2, I had 3 instances where I swiped my mouse across the pad and my mouse spun out a little bit where the sensor just kind of glitched. I wasn't able to replicate this issue, but I'm assuming it's coming from these very, very deep gaps in the surface stitching. Now, the big problem with this surfacing, in my opinion, is that because the pad is so soft, if you're putting pressure on top of these gaps here, you can actually cause these gaps to widen and potentially cause spin out issues on your sensor. Now, again, I wasn't able to verify this or replicate it. It was completely random, but the Fnatic Dash 2 is the only mousepad I have in my collection that has had this issues. I've never had spin out issues on any of my mice before, and it only happened on this pad. So I don't want to say the surfacing is causing it, but given what I'm seeing here with the surface material and how the stitching is done and the softness of this pad, I'm really left with no choice but to say it's probably these gaps in the stitching. With speed pads, we're supposed to see a much tighter knit surface, and these gaps in the surfacing just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, and I don't really understand why they did this. All right, now due to this 6mm thickness, the Fnatic Dash 2 does have the highest degree of control variability I've ever seen on a pad, which again, given the thickness, makes sense. Now, the surfacing is very soft. There is basically zero tension on the surface of this pad, so with very minimal weight, you actually sink your mouse very deep into the pad. I can literally take one finger and put it on top of my mouse pad with just like maybe like 100 grams of pressure and push it enough in where the base of the mouse rubs against the surface. Because it's so soft, the pad doesn't really fight you going down so much. It really just lets you go as deep as you want, where other pads have a little more surface tension which fights that, which allows you to have this like balance where you can push into the pad to get some extra control, but not so deep where you're rubbing the bottom of your mouse against the mouse pad. That does not happen here in the Dash 2. The Dash 2 just sinks in like nothing. So that is a big problem because the control variability is inconsistent depending on your grip style, depending on the skates you're using. It can be extremely variable, and as I mentioned before, because you can push so deep into the surface, you can widen these random gaps in the surface stitching, which can potentially cause sensor issues, which is something I did experience on this pad. One other big downside to the 6mm thickness here on the Fnatic Dash 2 is skate compatibility. Now, skate compatibility is often an issue on softer pads. We've seen this on the Infinity Mice Shogun and Control V2 and the Raven Mori V2. No real surprises with a soft pad, but a 6mm soft pad does have a lot of other problems. Now, with the Dash 2 being 6mm thick and the lack of surface tension here on the pad, pretty much every single mouse skate I have in my collection had problems. This includes the extra pad dot skates, donut skates, stock skates like the stock skates on my Sprime PM1, Sora V2, even the stock skates on my OP1 AK had problems where they were just so thin they couldn't compensate for the depth of the pad. Now, this obviously caused a lot of problems for my testing because I was constantly having these weird high friction moments because the bottom of my mouse was rubbing up against the surface, but it also just makes this pad unnecessarily hard to use because I had to use this like weird floated claw grip to use this pad even remotely normally. And then of course, on top of that, because the pad is so soft, if you really push into the pad to get some extra control, the added friction from trying to move through the pad is insanely high. So high, in fact, that it makes like micro flicking and that kind of stuff insanely hard to do and almost unnecessarily so. There were just so many downsides to the surfacing and in terms of skate compatibility. It was just a mess. The only mouse I have in my collection that did not have problems was my Zowie U2 with the gigantic stock skates because they are the highest surface area skates I've ever seen. That is the only mouse I did not have issues with skate compatibility, which is insane considering I have about 20 mice in my collection and only one of them was actually usable on this pad using my normal grip. So this is another really big downside because skate compatibility on the Dash 2 is horrible. Now, another confusing area here I wanted to talk about is the base performance. Now, the base is what's going to be making up the majority of the 6mm thickness that we see here on the Dash 2. Now, according to Fnatic, this is Fnatic Max foam. Now, despite Fnatic saying that this is Poron certified, the base here on the Fnatic Dash 2 doesn't perform anywhere near like the actual Poron base I have on the bottom of my Raven Mori V2. It is like completely different. I will say the material is Poron-like, and the base does get stickier, quote unquote, when you add moisture to the base and stick it to a desk. However, it's not stickier like how it is on the Raven Mori V2, where the base material is actually sticky. You have to peel it off your desk. Here on the Dash 2, it's more of like a surface tension thing where you put water as like a buffer between your desk surface and the pad itself, and that's how it adheres. I'm not going to say they're lying about the Poron base. Obviously, just it's so hard to verify what is actually real Poron nowadays because there's so much variations of it. I'm going to say it's a Poron-like material. I could be wrong, but regardless of what the base is actually made of, the base here on the Dash 2 is actually pretty good. It doesn't pass the one finger test, but it does have good adhesion when the force is applied to the top of it. I haven't had any instances of the pad moving when I was using it or anything like that. I didn't need to put water on it to adhere to my desk. It adhered totally fine to my countertop, no problems. Of course, the base performance will vary per desk and that kind of stuff, but my situation has been completely fine. No problems with it. It performed pretty much just like every other mousepad base, but it does not perform like a true Poron base. So I do question the Poron certified base here we see on the Dash 2. Now, the edge stitching is slightly below the surface level of the pad. It is rounded, but this is one area of the pad, as I mentioned before, where this causes an insane amount of drag on your arm doing y-axis movements up and down the sides of the pad. So the edge stitching is one of the biggest downsides of this pad. However, that's not because the edge stitching is bad. The edge stitching is actually very good. It's because of the thickness of the pad. If you look at the Raven Mori V2, it has pretty much the exact same kind of side stitching, but because the Raven Mori 2 is 4.3mm instead of 6mm, it doesn't have this y-axis drag issue that the Dash 2 does have. So the edge stitching is on paper fine, but in actuality, it does cause a lot of issues if you're putting your arm on the side of the desk and resting on the side of the mouse pad. As I mentioned before, this is going to be a situation where it'd be better to put your entire arm on the pad because that will have better performance, but that of course does have its own downsides because of how it works with your bare arm and how it works with arm sleeves. So let's talk about that next. Alrighty, now as I just mentioned, the surfacing of the Dash 2 does have a lot of similarities to the Raven Mori V2. It's just a little less pronounced. However, it does have the same situation as the Mori V2 where arm sleeves are going to be pretty much across the board negative in your experience. Now, when I say arm sleeves, I'm not talking about like a PTFE sleeve. That will be fine, but traditional arm sleeves like the Pulsar ES sleeve or the Focus sleeve or the Skypad sleeve are not going to operate well. They are just insanely high friction, and they make this pad even harder to use than it already is. So this is going to be a pad where I would recommend using your bare arm on the pad. However, this also has its own problems, because with the design of this pad, it's best to kind of keep as much of your arm as possible on the pad to prevent this extra drag from the edge stitching and the thickness of the pad. But the problem with that is that because the pad is so soft, your arm digs into the surface of this pad, and of course, like any soft surface is going to have a lot of additional friction. So what happens is that the bottom of your forearm digs into the pad and also causes an insane amount of friction when you're trying to move your arm across the pad. So unfortunately, pretty much whether you're using a bare arm or an arm sleeve on the Dash 2, you're pretty much going to have the same problem where you have this weird inconsistent friction caused by the softness of this pad. This honestly got so bad where I actually even used my Delta Hub Carpio on my forearm to try and use this pad in a way, but that also had its own problems because the Carpio skates couldn't account for the 6mm thickness, so that also had problems, but it was better than using my bare arm on the pad just because the pad's friction was so high. So again, this is just another area where this 6mm thickness just doesn't make sense because it's just causing so many problems where you're going to have inconsistent friction on this pad whether you're using your arm or an arm sleeve. The only way this pad is really usable is if you're using a completely floated grip like a donk grip, or you're doing fingertip grip where you're just not touching the pad at all, which unfortunately makes this pad just more confusing and even harder to use than it already is. Now, to Fnatic's credit, the extreme thickness of this pad does have one big benefit, and that is going to be the water resistance of this pad. Now, the surfacing of this pad is mostly hydrophobic. All the water will kind of peel off the surface and go into these gaps in the surface stitching and just drain into the pad. Now, there isn't a middle layer. There's basically just the extremely thick base, and then there's the surface stitching and the sub stitching. So just like pretty much everything else here with the Dash 2, this is going to be kind of an area where there is some mixed results. It can be really good, but it can also be really bad depending on your environment. I did soak the entire pad and do a couple runs on Kovacs. I didn't notice any issues, but I was using my larger surface area stock skates at the time just to prevent any issues with the skate incompatibility. So your results may vary, but for the most part, it is pretty good at dealing with water. But unfortunately, due to the thickness of the pad, there is just so many variables. I can't say it's good. I can't say it's bad. It will very much depend on your setup. Alrighty, well, in closing, my thoughts on the Dash 2 are very conflicting because, to be completely honest, when I first got this pad for the first couple of days, I was like, oh, this pad's amazing. It feels so good. It's so high quality. But the longer I used the pad, the more this unnecessary 6mm thickness started to ruin the experience. And this mouse pad just feels like a chore to use for me because there are just so many unnecessary hurdles I have to do to use this pad effectively, where I can just pull any of my other pads out of my closet and have no problems with those ones, where here on the Dash 2, there are just so many hoops to jump through. In my honest opinion, this mouse pad would be significantly better if the pad was thinner, maybe around 3.5 to 4mm thickness. This pad would be much better. If they could also address the weird gaps in the surface stitching and make the surface stitching tighter, that would also be a welcome change because that also has that weird sensor skipping that I only had on this pad. While this pad is a step in the right direction for Fnatic, they have unnecessarily over-engineered this pad, and this 6mm thickness just works against this pad in so many different ways. I can't recommend this pad because there are just too many executional problems on this pad. Too many hoops to jump through to make this pad usable. If you want a pad that works in kind of the same way that the Dash 2 does, where it's a speed pad but it feels a little more like a faster hybrid pad, get the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune. That pad is cheaper, performs better in every aspect in my opinion. It is just a much better pad. The Dash 2 is just incomplete in my opinion and just over-engineered, and there's just too many executional problems. All right, but that is going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much for watching. As always, I greatly appreciate it. Thank you again to Fnatic for making this video possible, for sending out the Dash 2 for review. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. That is the best way to directly support the channel, and members get their names shouted out at the end of videos, or you can use my affiliate links down in the video description at Lethal Gaming Gear, X-Ray Pad, and TJ exclusives to help support the channel that way. And as I mentioned before, with the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune, if you would like to learn more about that pad, you can check out my review of that pad. I will have that pinned at the end of the video, so you can go check that out if you're interested. But that is everything for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.